listening to Seeking Refuge, a podcast sharing the human stories of refugees. Today we're doing an episode that's a little bit different. 3 of our team members, Esha, Anusha, and Emily, will be discussing issues of colorism and racism within refugeeism. Refugeeism, by the way, is a word that refers to the condition of being a refugee. They talk about institutional and interpersonal racism as these things affect refugees. This is a topic that has become particularly salient with recent narratives, particularly in the US and Europe around Ukrainian refugees. Your hosts for today are Anusha Ghosh, Esha Hegde, and Emily Jensen.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Seeking Refuge. Today we'll be talking about racism and refugeeism. My name is Anusha, and I am here with Emily and Esha. We'll essentially be defining a few definitions of racism, as well as playing a few examples of racism against refugees. So before we start, engaging in our conversation about racism and refugeeism, I'll be defining the 3 main levels of racism. The first level is internalized racism. That includes self-stereotyping, incorporation of racist attitudes, stereotypes, prejudice or discrimination, beliefs or ideologies into one's worldview. And then we have interpersonal racism, which is defined as racially motivated interactions between individuals. It covers all interactions or behavior between individuals that are racist or have racist content, and covers a range of types of racist incidents, from microaggressions to racist name-calling and racial bullying and harassment to discrimination and racist hate crimes. Then we have institutionalized racism, which is what we're going to be, for the most part, discussing in this episode, because it's a level of racism that's accessible and publicly distributed on the internet. Institutionalized racism is defined as social and cultural forces, institutions, ideologies, and processes that interact to create and reinforce inequalities between ethnic groups. It's important to note that the culture of an institution and the unconscious bias of the people who make up that institution constitute racist attitudes and behaviors that are dangerous. And so all of these definitions, they came from the Cambridge University Press that was published on June 17, 2021. And obviously all of these definitions are malleable, but these were the best definitions that I found on the internet that were encompassing of all the 3 levels of racism. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking a lot about institutionalized racism. I'm going to play a few clips, mostly from media reporters that are publicly saying certain comments about refugees that is distributed to the public. So I'll be playing this first clip first. The following audio clip is from anchorman Peter Dobby about the Ukrainian crisis.
Pictures of some of the refugees trying to get on trains or trying to get out of Ukraine. And what's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm looking to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
What are y'all's thoughts on this? What he said, what it means, how it can result in discrimination against refugees based on their race, ethnicity, and such?
I guess when I was watching that, I was thinking back to discussions I've had recently about how people view refugees and what they think of when they think of the word refugee. And it's a very othering word, and that's how a lot of people view refugees, as the other. And so people put in a box what the other is of from what they see of the stereotype of a Middle Eastern refugee. Yeah. To some extent, you can only understand things through what you've seen, but it is startling almost to see someone limit their understanding so much by race and by how they view them.
I thought it was very interesting how he equated Ukrainian, obviously European, ethnically European refugees to automatically like being middle class and educated, and then he said these aren't like the Middle Eastern refugees that we see. And I think that was very hinging on the fact that this anchor automatically deemed like Middle Eastern and people who weren't ethnically European and were migrants or refugees as being less educated, not in the middle class, like automatically a lower socioeconomic status, and that them coming to a country would automatically bring that country's economy down, which is an incredibly, that's the entire assumption I think his statement is based off of. And I think just through doing the podcast and listening to our episodes and editing them and interviewing people, you just see how much people from all parts of the world have to bring, how educated they are, how much passion they have for things that's just sometimes unfortunately left undiscovered because of the turmoil that they've had to face. And I think that was an incredibly harsh assumption and judgment that he made that was very clear in his statements.
Yeah. Oh yeah, go ahead.
When you were saying that, Esha, I was reminded of something our president Aidan often likes to point out, is that there's a lot of assumptions that refugees will be bad for the economy, will only pull from it. Yeah. But the reality is that they give a lot to economies of their host countries. And so I thought that the fact that what he's saying or is insinuating is in fact the opposite of reality.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really good. Yeah, so, when I first saw this clip, it was on Twitter, and it was obviously comments about the Ukrainian crisis that's happening right now. I was kind of startled by how I feel like one of the only reasons why he mentioned that they were middle class, that they were prosperous, was to evoke an emotional response from the audience, as if you can only really feel sympathy for someone who is like you, who is middle class, who's prosperous. But, it's important to note that regardless of a refugee's, race, socioeconomic class, regardless of any of that, they deserve refuge. That's what my initial thought was, the fact that he thought the only way that he could get the audience to listen was to mention those details.
I would assume that he's not just saying that for the audience's sake, he's saying it for his own.
Right.
Yeah. That is his expectation, and so he assumes that that's what the audience also needs to relate to them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so that was the first clip. Here's another one.
I love that everyone calls everyone out on Twitter now.
Yeah. The following audio clip is from reporter Degata from CBS News.
The calculus entirely. Tens of thousands of people have tried to flee the city. There will be many more. People are hiding out in bomb shelters. But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So it's partly human nature, but they are not in denial. Now with the...
Yeah.
Ooh, he said there's a lot to unpack there. First off, this anchor automatically said, unwittingly stated his opinion going off, this isn't Iraq or Afghanistan, this is a civilized place, where you wouldn't expect this to happen. And I think that really bottles down to what our society as a whole views Europeans, white people, usually as being more civilized than people of color. And I think that's an incredibly huge assumption, underlying thought of his that just came to light through that, obviously.
Also, I feel like it's another instance of being in direct contradiction of reality with saying that there's not been any conflict there for decades, when if you actually look, there has been conflict there. He's just ignoring what doesn't fit his narrative.
again, like he has to, the fact that they have to note that, the people who are suffering in the Ukrainian crisis, they have to note that they're civilized in order for the world to care. That kind of like, while they're like, uplifting this crisis as much as it deserves to be uplifted, because the people of Ukraine are going through such a crisis right now. They're kind of like, as they're like uplifting the Ukrainian crisis, they're kind of like downplaying other crises. Like when you say like, these are civilized people, they don't, these are people like us, they don't deserve this. What are you saying about, people that you don't consider civilized? Like,
and what are you saying about us? Like, who is us?
Yeah.
And I think this anchor, obviously our listeners can't see, but this anchor seems to be like a white man.
Yeah.
So he's referring to us as other white people, which is very interesting, because I think when you do a lot of research on the crisis going on in Ukraine, you see how hard it is for students who are studying in Ukraine, who are from other countries. Like I heard a lot about students from India and like Middle Eastern countries as well, who have just had such a hard time fleeing Ukraine, fleeing this crisis, and are seen, when they're trying to enter other countries as issues, and it's just harder for them to. And, you start to wonder based on his comments, like, these are students who, maybe they're not Ukrainian citizens, but have been in Ukraine for quite some time, studying, getting a degree of some sort. And it's just so interesting how they're the ones being stopped because, they do not codify or align with what one assumes a Ukrainian would look like.
But also the fact that they meet the qualifications that they're putting out of these Ukrainian refugees.
Yeah.
They're educated, they're middle class, they're working hard to create a better life, and they fit all those perfectly, but they're being disadvantaged.
Yeah, okay. So I have one last clip. The following audio clip is from Ukraine's Deputy Chief Prosecutor on the BBC.
I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
And so, of course, I understand and respect the emotion. What you are outlining there is this tension between longer-term efforts to apply pressure to Vladimir Putin, such as financial sanctions, and the very immediate military threat which you're experiencing.
He very clearly stated that the value of the Ukrainian people as refugees are that they are white and that they fit like views of whiteness, and so that makes them more deserving.
I have a class with Aidan, our president of the podcast right now, and it's called Decolonization in Asia, and it's an excellent class. And one of our class periods, we were watching a documentary, and it was about the Vietnam War, and there was, I believe, like a U.S. general or some sort of like chief of the United States Army, and he stated, he was like, Southeast Asian people do not have the same compassion or empathy for their brothers, for their fellow, countrymen. And even though he didn't say that in the exact same words, it was what he was essentially saying, and then that video was paralleled with the immense amounts of violence going on in Vietnam at the time. And I feel like that's incredibly parallel to this video clip that we just saw, where he's essentially stating that white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people have a different compassion and empathy that's just so much more, or so much more pronounced than refugees and migrants from other parts of the world who happen to not be white. There's a different value for life. And I think that's very interesting and an incredibly damaging narrative, because you're completely right, Anusha. I think we, as a society, should not minimize the violence going on in Ukraine. We should continue to uplift it, but we should also recognize that there are other crises going on right now in the world in relation to refugees and migrants that need just as much recognition, that need just as much, compassion and I guess just like a social movement surrounding it, as has been going on, thankfully, with the, Ukrainian crisis. And just because there should be no underlying assumption that just because those people aren't white, that they don't hurt, need help, that they're just kind of used to this, because that's obviously not a situation anyone should be in, and it doesn't matter if you're white or not white.
I have a clip here. This one's a little different than the ones that we heard before. This is a report by the CBS Saturday Morning News, in which they detail the stories of refugees in Ukraine who are facing discrimination at the border as they're trying to flee. This is racial discrimination, and I'll play it right here.
Virtually day one of the war, reports of discrimination at the Ukraine border began to surface.
Mostly they would consider white people first, Indian people, Arabic people, before black people.
We went to the train station, and they will not let us in. And when they did let us in, they were like, you have to give us money, because this is not for free for you, because you're foreign. This is not free for you.
Okay, so what are y'all's thoughts on that?
You know, that's extremely heartbreaking to hear. As I mentioned earlier, I've heard of similar scenarios of that happening in relation to the Ukrainian crisis. And part of me, I'm pretty divided on how to feel about it. So part of me wants to say this is an extremely negative situation, but are these minorities within Ukraine's experiences amplified by the fact that Eastern Europe is so homogenous of a region that these experiences are horrible and horrifying, but is it amplified because they are such a small minority group there? But I feel like that's unfortunately not the case, even though that's still an extremely negative situation to be in. I feel like it's more the case that we're thinking of. These people who are obviously not white are kind of left stranded because they don't seem fit to help by countries surrounding Ukraine right now, which is incredibly horrifying to hear.
I agree, but I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it is both. That they are being put in such a bad place and being treated so horribly, and that is only made worse by their
extreme minorities within a very homogenous region.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that that's just an amplifying factor to the already bad situation that they're in.
Yeah, no, it's definitely concerning because, in this episode we're discussing, racism against refugees. And not only did we previously just view how racism against refugees is happening with entire crises, but we're seeing how they're happening within crises themselves. Even the Ukrainian crisis, which has been at the forefront of news, there's still discrimination. So that was all of my examples for institutionalized racism. And then I had one example of interpersonal racism. We won't be discussing internalized racism today because that's obviously something that should be said through the voice of a refugee. The viewers can't see this, but I'm currently showing Esha and Emily a survey. And essentially it's a survey distributed by Pew Research in spring 2016. And it's a survey detailing or just asking Europeans if they see diversity as making their countries better. And the results of the survey were that very few Europeans say growing diversity makes their country a better place to live. In Greece, 63% say that growing diversity makes it a worse place to live, and then 10% a better place to live. And this survey is one of many surveys just about the refugee crisis. I chose this specific survey because it talks specifically about race. Obviously, people around the world, they have beliefs about refugees that might be tied to other issues, but this one is specifically connected to race. So what is everyone's ideas or thoughts on this?
So I don't want to generalize European people as a whole, but I'm going to start off kind of rant that my French teacher in high school who was born in France told me that really, really stuck with me. And of course, this is most likely a generalization, but I think it could definitely be applied to this. She stated the fact, she's grown up in France her whole life, and she's like, French people hate being mistaken as even other European people. So like if you go up to a person from France and say, oh, like, are you from Italy? They would, be like, oh no, like I'm from France, like I'm from, like this region of France. It's like not they wouldn't get like flabbergasted, like get out of my house or something, but it would be something that takes them aback. And I think that's very different in between like Europe and America, because I feel like if I like went up to you, Emily, and I was like, oh, Emily, like, are you French? Like, are you from France? Like, you'd be like, oh, like, no, I'm not. That wouldn't be something that you were even immediately taken aback by. Maybe this is just like within my friend group, but it's, being mistaken for another group, ethnic group, cultural group is not something that immediately, I think, takes a lot of people in our age group, at least, within our society aback, as my French teacher described it did. And then, when I got to college, I'm like a history minor, and I've taken like a lot of history classes centering around European history. I just started thinking about how much of our education as a whole is so catered around, I'll throw like Western society, upholding Western society and what it means to be a Western, in this case, European nation. Like a lot of classic literature written by European people, a lot of like, I don't know, I took AP Euro in high school. Like there's an entire class centering around European civilization. And I think that obviously shows how much of an emphasis classical, traditional, very white European civilization has on the world as a whole. And I think for many, based on this poll, it seems that refugees and migrants stand as an imminent threat to their culture, society, their Europeanness, just from their inclusion into, a place like Greece, which should not be the case at all. I just feel like there is some sort of threat to the apparent threat, should not be the case, to like the ethnic Greek identity based on the fact that, now a refugee from Syria and their family are coming, into Greece, which should obviously not be the case. And it's very unfortunate to see that that is the case. But I wonder if in order to ease that stress that many, I'm using Greece as an example because that's what you did, but many ethnically Greek people may feel is by, emphasizing how much these refugees could not only add to Greek culture, but also how much they could appreciate it as, as a whole. How blessed or happy they may feel to just be here in the first place, which I think refugees and migrants are often seen as leeches and not people who are very appreciative and very happy to be where they are. They're often, never characterized in that light. And I wonder if we as a society start characterizing them as, and appreciative people only through passing the mic, giving them a time to share their story. Will these people start realizing hey, they do want to appreciate traditional culture, and maybe they can bring some of their culture that will add to ours, even more so. Sorry, that was a very
that was really good.
Yeah, great answer.
So that's essentially what the survey was about. That was a really good introspect into this. Yeah. So when I first saw this survey, I was kind of taken aback because, living in America, obviously, we do struggle a lot, but I've never seen diversity as a threat. I've never really been around people who have seen diversity as a threat. And again, this is probably because I'm a minority woman and the certain environment I'm in doesn't really face that. But the fact that Europeans may not want refugees simply because they don't look like the refugees that are coming in is concerning. And I can't imagine how you can exactly unravel that, because it seems like it's like a cultural belief that's very embedded within society. It's not something that you can necessarily fix with a policy. And, what's that to say? If refugees can't change their race, they can't change how they look. They certainly can't change how other people view them. But they need refuge, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what they look like. And how can one, unravel this belief to make them be able to have a safe place to be home? Yeah.
On that, I feel like a lot of what you're saying is that we need societal shifts in our understanding, both of race and of refugees. And as you were saying that, I was looking at the chart, I guess, and Greece and Italy are the two places with the highest numbers or percentages of people saying that diversity makes their country a worse place to live. And I thought that was really interesting, because so much of European history and whiteness is rooted in ancient Greek and ancient Italian culture, and how there was the Renaissance and neoclassicism going back and pulling on their ancient cultures. And so how they're very tied to whiteness, to Europeanness, to Western society and ideals of Westernness. And so I think it's very interesting that they're at the top of the list, because they're so involved historically. Yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting connection.
That was really good. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I didn't even I didn't realize that, but that makes sense. It is deeply rooted, in the history that we're taught. Yeah, it's not something that's gonna unravel easily. But I guess as podcast members, we can do what we can to spread awareness about racism and refugeeism. And that's what I really attempted to do with this episode, because I feel like, not just this podcast, but I feel like, a lot of refugee resources, refugee advocates, racism and refugeeism is definitely something that needs to be talked about more. Hopefully this is just a little molecule on the top of the iceberg, and we'll continue to do things like this. We're obviously gonna shine more of a light. Racism and refugeeism has been a thing for decades, but it really came to light with this Ukrainian crisis, because obviously through Twitter, we were able to see so many video clips of reporters quite directly being racist in their comments against Ukrainian refugees and other refugees from the Middle East. So, hopefully by bringing light to that, bringing light to their words, as well as the truth behind them, we brought awareness to this really important topic. Okay, so thank you all so much for listening to another episode of Seeking Refuge. We'll see you soon. Here are a few words from Emily and Esha on topics unrelated to any specific question I asked in the episode.
This is just a thought that I'm having. I also wonder if Ukraine, based off of this Twitter thread, is now suddenly more European, because a lot of Western Europe, and obviously America, has a lot of qualms with Russia as a whole. And so now we would like to categorize Ukraine as this extremely white, extremely homogenous region filled with middle-class people, because of the fact that it is Russia that's antagonizing it. Yeah. And I wonder, what if Poland was antagonizing Ukraine, or Germany was, would it be the same fact?
No, I think that's a really good point, because race is very much a social construct that's defined by space and time, and whatever benefits the white nation, essentially. So I think that is a very good question. And
you should talk about what this Twitter thread is about.
Oh, yeah. So it's a Twitter thread by Kimberly St. Julian Farnan, and she is a historian, and she is basically describing how
How Ukraine has not always been characterized as like a white nation, I should say.
How Ukraine has not always been characterized as a white nation, and that they are often at the bottom of the European racial hierarchy, and often in past situations they have not been seen as European enough, which falls on what Esha said of like, if it was another country, would they be seen as European enough in this situation?
That's really, thank you so much for that. That was really, that's really good.
Well, it's a sad Twitter.
Yeah.
That was Esha, Anusha, and Emily talking to us about how institutional and interpersonal racism affects refugees. If you liked this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, rate, and review us in the comments below. It helps listeners like you find our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, email us at seekingrefugepodcast@gmail.com or at our University of South Carolina email address, sosrpa@mailbox.sc.edu. You can find us on social media at Refuge Podcast on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. The show is produced by undergraduate students at the University of South Carolina. Your hosts for this week were Anusha Ghosh, Esha Hegde, and Emily Jensen. This episode was edited by Anusha Ghosh and Aidan Thomason. Our executive producer is Aidan Thomason. As always, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.